Now there's a real beauty. Back in its natural environment.
Do you think that's any way to open a movie? Bass
Why not?
tournament in Tennessee?
For somebody that's in the outboard motor business, there probably isn't any more logical way to begin anything than by fishing. Because of all the reasons people own boats and motors, and goodness knows there's hundreds of them, fishing is the number one.
Do you think these motors are better than the ones you made a number of years ago?
Much better. They're much more sophisticated. They do things more easily. I don't think there's any way to compare outboard motors made 20 years ago or even 10 years ago with the ones that are on the market today. They didn't have the same kind of ignition systems. They didn't have as sophisticated blower units, as sophisticated engines, and they weren't built to the rigid, uniform quality specifications that they can be built with on modern tools.
You know, it's a lucky business. Here we are on a work day, sitting in a boat in the middle of a lake.
Well, you learn how people use our product, learn whether or not it's doing the job they want it to do. And the name of the game is finding out what the customer is going to do, and then make sure that the customer, after he gets the boat and has it in use, has bought what he expected to buy, and it's doing what he expected it to do.
To whom should we talk?
Well, fishermen, bass fishermen, any kind of fishermen, offshore, northern, southern, water skiers.
Do you think it's worthwhile to go through the plant?
Well, I tell you, it's hard to realize the complexity and the massive tooling that goes into producing outboard motors. You need to talk to people who run the factory, who put this complex thing with over 4,000 people involved together and make it work. You should very definitely talk to Dick Pope, because water skiing is one of the most important, and he will have probably as complicated and as continuous and as long service with outboards as any person in the world, bar none.
The outboard motors are the only kind. They're flexible, they move fast, they carry the load, and they're spectacular. People just scream and clap when they come in on that first charge. They make 3 of them come by at one time. Of course, the wake picks up and it flies and meets each other, and there it is. It's up in the air, and the boats go by, and the people start clapping.
How many impressions of Johnson have?
Oh, I don't know. It's up in the millions. It's definitely in the millions. We have books on just Johnson alone. I don't know how many of them there are.
Well, when did
they're pasted in big ones. Well, this started in 1926. Demonstrations are the greatest way in the world to sell something. And lots of products don't stand that demonstration. But when you see the boats perform out here, and they don't know it, but the boat drivers are the most important thing in giving a good show. The skiers could not perform if there was any doubt in their mind that the drivers and the Johnson motors weren't going to perform well. They couldn't perform well. I'm not kidding you.
If you had to do it over again, what would you have done differently?
I don't know. We've been terribly successful. You can always make mistakes, but
You don't think you made any big ones?
no, that made really well a couple of big ones.
Well, how about your guess about outboard motors?
Oh, well, listen, we couldn't do it with anything but outboard motors. It's the motor, and I think most people realize that.
You're really proud of this place.
Oh, yes, I really am proud of it. It's like when I introduced to our president. He said to me, Cypress Gardens you're from. Oh, that's where they have those pretty ski girls. and actually, with good motors like Johnson's and good drivers like we have and beautiful girls, you can't go wrong.
Well, and if you do go wrong, at least you're not sorry.
Well, yeah.
We test outboard engines and stern drives.
Just Johnson?
Johnson's, Evinrude's, and OMC stern drives. We also evaluate competitors' engines. Most of our effort goes towards on-the-water endurance testing or life testing of outboard engines.
You mean you run until it breaks down?
Right, yep, life testing of the various engines. We also run a number of other types of testing that would be more developmental in nature. We do a lot of carburation work here. This is on-the-water development of carburetors that give the best fuel economy throughout the range possible with the engine configuration such as we're putting in production.
Is that easier to do than it would be in Waukegan?
Yes, because the weather is warm down here, closer to what the average boater would see than what they would have in Waukegan.
How many boats would you say are around here?
Approximately 200 boats.
How many people do run them?
Well, it ranges between 12 and 14 drivers. We have a total of 55 people. Mechanics, technicians, maintenance personnel. We also have a group that does quality control testing on production engines. And then we have a group that works strictly on carburation development.
Get to know the boats pretty well.
Yes. Our engines are used on all different sorts of hulls. Semi-Vs, cathedral hulls with deep Vs, and the hollowed out log that is 35 feet long came from Colombia, South America.
And they use that?
Yes, they use this particular boat on the rivers in South America. About 35 feet long, and it's only about 4 feet wide. It's made out of one hollowed out log, and it'll carry up to about 10,000 pounds of freight. These boats are usually propelled by one small outboard, not small outboard, but anywhere from 20 to a 40 horsepower.
If you shut down this unit, I mean, if you didn't have this test station, what would happen to Johnson? I mean, the motors would still come out of the factory.
Yes, they would, and there probably wouldn't be too much notice for several months. But eventually the quality of the product would decrease drastically.
Well, how do you work with Waukegan? Do you verify things that they suspect up there, or?
We try to find malfunctions where people haven't found them yet. The primary way we find them is just putting the motors on boats and running them. The endurance test program stresses the engines quite highly. We would try to do in 100 hours of running what a customer might do in 250 hours.
So you mean you actually go full bore for 100 hours?
Right, yes,
You bang these motors around about as much as any driver would.
Right.
The boat owners themselves are not careful, or you assume they're not careful.
We assume they're not careful. We try to go one step beyond this. Most of our engines are on quite fast boats, and we run them at high speed. Most of our dual installation boats run them at high speeds across rough water. And the engines clear the water and dig in, and we run across sandbars. And of course, during the course of the running that we do, underwater obstructions are encountered. We make high-speed turns, which stresses all of the lower unit castings very highly.
How does Johnson stand up against the others?
Well, I'll have to say I'm prejudiced, but still, the Johnson engines stand up better than anything on the market right now.
Well, if they didn't, you'd be worried about it.
That's right. And we're, of course, constantly working to keep the Johnson quality and the Johnson durability above everybody else's. We have 30 endurance boats set up to run all the time.
That's steady running?
That's steady running. Because if we feel something would run in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 hours under our particular type of testing, the customers shouldn't have much problem with it. Projecting this into a customer life, it would certainly run 1,000 to 1,500 hours.
Then you really have a bunch of maniacs out here.
I wouldn't say that.
What do you do, go down to traffic court and pick up your driver?
No, not at all. The drivers that we have are very well qualified people. When we hire a test driver, we hire a fellow with the thought in mind that we're going to want to develop him into a mechanic, technician, or some other type of person that would be able to work inside. The experience that the people get running the boats is quite valuable, and this is just part of a training program.
Johnson outboards are a pretty good machine right now, aren't they? Compared to the competition, aren't they?
We
Aren't they
think
pretty good?
they're the finest in the world.
Well, then, why do you need an engineering department? Why don't you just keep on making them?
Well, if you do no more than stand still, you fall behind because the rest of the world is going to move. There's technological developments in all fields that we're able to draw on. Years back when outboard motors were small and fuel was cheap, why fuel economy was not a big consideration in the design of an outboard motor. With the fact that we now build 200 horsepower motors and fuel has become much more expensive or relatively expensive, why there's a big thrust in fuel economy. So we've got a whole area of development that really hasn't been looked at. Our competitors are of course moving, but also people that complement our product, namely the boat manufacturers, are constantly coming up with new hull designs, new deck configurations that allow different loadings than we've had in the past, people riding forward, bait wells full of water, live wells, that sort of thing, so that we have to constantly be developing the motors to match these changes in the boats. We have some engines in the line, some of the smaller engines like the 4 and 6 horsepower, which have been pretty much unchanged except for refinements for a good number of years. However, the 9.9 was a totally new engine 3 or 4 years ago. We felt we could do a better job of it. We felt that we had learned how to make an engine smaller and lighter. So when there was some technology that would offer us a more compact, a lighter engine, well, we went ahead and redid that engine. The 25 right now, portions of it are quite new. Some of the design, these clamp screw areas, go back into the mid-50s because we don't really see a way to make them any better. 55 and the 70 and 75 horsepower, these were a totally new engine in the late 60s, early 70s. From there they've been refined. Obviously the V6 is in many instances a totally new engine. We're constantly looking at each engine and its position in the marketplace and its position relative to the technology based on what marketing says is important this year, next year, the year after. We run a lot of competitive testing. We do it as kind of a check on ourselves just to make sure we haven't missed anything. I think in general most of the people that have copied our motors know something about what they're doing, and they are not exact copies, but they don't have one of the things we have is simply the many, many years of experience of knowing what will or won't work in certain applications. Saltwater corrosion is a particular instance. There are many little design tricks of not using dissimilar metals in water pump areas or using certain gasket materials and making sure you have barriers between dissimilar castings and things that apparently get overlooked in some of these copies. Basically, the outboard motor design groups have the responsibility for a product 3 years hence. After we make these first prototype or the first couple of them, we have to go back and redesign and then remake certain areas just to get the thing together oftentimes. From there we go into different kinds of testing. Engines that are used for racing have to be tested under different RPM and speed conditions and ones that are used for fishing, that sort of thing.
Then you're always looking for trouble.
We're always looking for trouble, we're always looking for improvement.
Well, you've seen a lot of changes.
Yes.
As you look back, what would you say was the great change?
You hear so many people talk about automation, the age of automation. Well, when I came to work at Johnson's, many of the machines were driven by belts with a common line shaft from the ceiling. And over a period of many years, these machines were replaced with their own motorized equipment, their own self-controlled facilities. And as time went on, of course, and the volume of production increased, the type of equipment that we use dramatically changed over the years. And of course, now with high volume production, the type of machinery that's used is highly mechanized and automated as compared to the first days working here at Johnson's.
You know, people always say they don't make them the way they used to, whatever they're talking about. Is that true?
No, that isn't true. When I came to work here, the quality of a product depended entirely upon the skill and the feel and the touch of a mechanic. Now, we had some mighty fine mechanics in that day that could sense and feel within thousandths. And now we have machines without any input on the part of the operator that holds tolerances in tenths of thousandths. And there is no question what the accuracy is much greater. And you can repeat one part after another in absolute exact likeness, one with another, which was a very difficult thing to do in the early days when this was all done by hand.
Right.
And while the men were highly skilled men, their skill now is to operate sophisticated electronic machinery, and that's where their skill is brought into play now, where it was mostly done with their hands and in their head in making a very commonplace basic machine do accurate work or close work.
You start from the very beginning.
We start at the scrap metal and make our own alloy. We subsequently make our own die castings. Then we machine all our own parts and fabricate them. We say we use aluminum, which is of course quite true. The basic engine is composed of mostly aluminum parts, but we have 5 different kinds of alloys. And there is one alloy that we make that's specifically to resist saltwater corrosion. There's another alloy that has to be made for strength, extreme stresses and strength. We have still another alloy that will give, it'll bend, you can re-straighten it. So there are 5 different kinds of alloys that we use for the different needs in the product. First of all, we start out with an alloy that resists saltwater corrosion. That's number 1. Then we go into a special process we call the lifonite process that oxidizes the surface of the metal and presents a surface that resists saltwater corrosion. Many people get the impression that an outboard motor is something like an appliance, something less or different than an automobile. But once they come in here, they see that our piston rings are made not to automobile standards of quality, but aircraft standards of quality. Our pistons are all machined with diamonds to hold the accuracy and the fine finishes and mid-inch that is required. And all of that is because your engine doesn't have a heavy-bodied oil to lubricate around the rings. It just has that gasoline with a little smattering of oil. And you've got to have fine precision. And over the years, of course, to get higher performing engines, closer fits are necessary, more accuracy. The engines are wound up higher now, 5,500 RPMs as opposed to in the 3,000 range for an automobile engine is quite, or 4-cycle engine. It's quite a dramatic difference. But outboard motors today are real fine pieces of precision machinery.
Well, how long do the Johnson last?
That's one of our problems. They last, they last so long. It really is a fact. Some years ago, we advertised to buy the first 50 engines that were ever built in the 20s. And it was amazing how much response we got. But we had so many we couldn't buy them. We didn't want that many. It might surprise you to know that probably 1 out of every 2 engines that are sold in the world, I'm speaking of Johnson's now, are sold in markets outside of the United States.
What is your biggest foreign producing area?
Belgium. They sell in the common market. We ship die castings and all the outboard parts to Sydney, Australia for assembly and for testing and shipping out of Australia. And so we've got this new plant in Hong Kong.
Belgium, Hong Kong, and Australia?
And the Canadian plant.
But this is headquarters here. I mean, the innovations, the engineering, the testing is from here.
Right, that's right. Of course, I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I don't believe Johnson has any peers. We are number 1 in sales in the world. We have sold more outboard motors than any manufacturer in the world. And we are leading in sales for several reasons. A very good service organization, a good marketing organization, and of course an outstanding product. And that's about it in a nutshell.
And why do you race?
We race for 2 fundamental reasons. One is the image from excelling at performance activity. The more important one is the engineering development that racing gives us. The fact that we have races at fairly regular intervals provides a series of deadlines for our technical people, and they have to work furiously between the races to come up with new developments. And the net result of this has been, over the last decade, a great many innovations which have fed back into the commercial engines which we sell to the public. Typical example might be the SST propellers, which are derived both from the designs and the manufacturing techniques originally developed for the racing use.
I hear that you used to be a driver.
Oh, a long while ago, before World War II. I'm with Johnson because they needed a better performance image for Johnson after many years of not being involved in performance work, and I joined the company at the time that decision was made. Every time you go out, you put your reputation on the line, and there are many, many things involved in these very high-speed races in which we run, over and above the engine, a boat which will stay on the water and run at the very high speeds which are necessary and not fly. When I say fly, I mean do a back loop. As we reach speeds that are high enough that the drivers can't use it all the time in a boat race, the driver becomes a very critical factor, a man who is willing to hang it all out and use as much of the power, as much of the time as he can.
What is it that you're looking for in this race?
Well, we're here in Beloit, aside from the normal aspects of racing, namely to prove our product, we as a company have built a new parts and accessories depot.
This is a modern plant.
It's a fantastic plant. It's totally automated, computer-controlled automatic storage warehouse, 8 stories high.
For all over the world?
Primarily, of course, for the U.S., but bulk shipments of parts from here to all over the world. One of the races happened to be the World Championship for the Sports E-Class. Absolutely stock, out-of-the-box engine. As you purchase it from the dealer, you're allowed to use any propeller you want on it.
And those engines are mounted on small tunnel boats, semi-airborne craft. It's in the 75 to 80 mile an hour range. And I believe 15 boats started in the race, and it was quite exciting. The driver has the option of picking his best performance in 3 out of the 4 heats to determine whether he becomes world champion or not. The big event, which is a single race, I think of 100 laps for Mod U, which means anything goes. And that's where you'll see the Big Johnson racing version of the Johnson 200 in action.
Do you break the engines down afterwards, as they might in the endurance testing at Stuart?
Oh, indeed.
Races?
After this race, all of these engines will come apart and be studied for any signs of undue distress or what have you. And whatever developments have been made in the intervening week or two in power will be put back into them.
Then racing is really very important to Johnson.
Oh, it is indeed. We run a lot of races. And really, it's not what you win or what you lose. It's the fact that you're in there and people know that Johnsons run very fast. And the net result is that you get an image of having a performance engine. Obviously, where Johnson is today is #1 in world sales.